There's been a lot of discussion around butter, dairy, and the use of palm oil. I and others thought there was value in having a discussion with experts to understand the fundamental questions better. This is first of two discussions to provide perspective on the issue. This is brought to you by Dairy at Guelph and Food Focus. My name is Mike von Massa. Today, I speak to three experts to learn more about palm oil, its use in dairy rations, and how its use may or may not affect both milk composition and processed dairy products. I learned a lot and found there is a lot more to learn. The conversation today is with Dr. Alejandro Marangoni, who is a professor in food science at the University of Guelph and the Canada Research Chair in Food, Health and Aging, Dr. John Cant, who is a professor of dairy cattle nutrition and director of the Center for Nutrition Modeling at the University of Guelph, and Dr. Dave Kelton, a veterinarian, professor of epidemiology in the Ontario Veterinary College, and Dairy Farmers of Ontario Chair in Dairy Cattle Health. I am sure you will find the discussion as interesting as I did. Gentlemen, thanks so much for taking the time. I'm looking forward to our conversation because I'm sure I'll learn quite a bit. And so, without further ado, let's get straight to the discussion. We're talking a little bit about sort of butter and palm oil and the issues that have been raised recently in the industry relative to dairy. So, before we get into dairy specifically, Alejandro, I was wondering if you could sort of say, what is palm oil? How is it used in the food industry, and why is it used in the food industry?
No, thanks, Mike. Yes, palm oil is the oils. I mean, oil seed. It's not an oil seed, but the oil producing crop, the largest one in the world. To give you an idea, there's about 75 million metric tons of palm oil produced in the world, like in the past year. To compare that to soybean, which is 60, rapeseed oil is about 27. Sunflower seed is about 20, that kind of thing. So it's 75. It's the most highly produced oil. So it is widely available. It is inexpensive, and it's produced mainly in the countries of Southeast Asia and some of them in Latin America. So Malaysia being one of the largest producers. Now Indonesia has taken over. Indonesia, Malaysia, and a lot of countries in South America are attempting to establish a palm oil plantation. Interestingly, it's the African palm tree, but Africa is not a large producer of palm oil.
Yeah.
Many of the trees came originally from Nigeria. But if you go to Malaysia and you drive towards Singapore, all you see is one large palm oil plantation from side to side of the country. So they tend to take over the country. It is inexpensive, produced in large amounts, and it's very functional because it is about 50% unsaturated, or think about unsaturated fats being oils, liquid oil, and 50% saturated. So you mix the two of them together and you get rheological properties that are ideal to make things like bakery products, to give some solidity to food products. So they're used extensively all over the world for manufactured food products. Um, because they're inexpensive, widely available. And palm oil came to be really when we had a ban on hydrogenated fat, or the food manufacturers, had to declare the amount of hydrogenated fat in their products. Then they became very scared, and they needed a replacement really fast, and they couldn't really go back to animal fats because that's a no-no because of many different reasons. And so palm oil came to be at that point. 2006 was the year that legislation came to be, and then the world changed, and everybody changed towards palm oil. So we replaced all the hydrogenated and partially hydrogenated fat with the saturated fat from the palm oil. Moreover, there's an enormous oleochemical industry in Malaysia. So they split the fat, they make fatty acids, they make glycerin, they make biodiesel. It forms the basis for other like surfactants. Very, very active over there. So basically widely available, and the derivatives from palm oil are widely available in the world as well. Lately, many countries don't want to consume palm oil, particularly in Europe. It has become a very, very important trend because of the issues with sustainability. So the fingerprint, the sustainability fingerprint of palm oil is very poor because it grows in tropical rainforests, and they're home to a great biodiversity. The last remaining biodiversity of the world is in many of those tropical rainforests, which unfortunately get cut down for the establishment of palm oil plantations. And that is happening in the Amazon, and that happened in Malaysia. and it's definitely happened in Indonesia. You see all those fires that are happening over there. A lot of time they're cutting down the forests of Borneo to establish plantations, which represents economic value to the people, progress. And as well, don't forget that everybody criticizes palm oil for this issue with sustainability, and there's even places that are beginning to ban palm oil in Europe. But it also provides a cheap nutrition, inexpensive nutrition to a lot of the world's poor in India, in Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, China, in the backwoods of China. So it's an important food for a lot of places in the world. And I guess it's used also in animal feed.
Yeah, and we'll get to that with John in a second. I just want to ask one follow-up question, and it relates to, so palm oil has both desirable qualities that you talked about, and it's cheap. But given some of the concerns around sustainability, we are doing things to try and get to get other fats to perform like palm oil does. And I know you've done some of that research. I spoke to your PhD students separately a couple of weeks ago, and that will be coming out soon. Tell us a little bit about that, just as an aside here.
As an aside, I mean, we try to do new things here at the university. So if the whole purpose there is, if you do not want to have hydrogenated fat, if you do not want to have animal fats, meaning beef fat like tallow, pork fat, lard, and you do not want to have hydrogenated fats, you're left with very little. There are no real options to add to, I mean, other than cocoa butter, which is the fat in chocolate, and some exotic butters of some weird palm trees here and there. There really is nothing else out there. So what we try to do is invent ways to gel oils. We actually started the whole area of oleogels, in which we take unconventional food molecules and make them self-assemble in the oil, and they make things like oil jello of different hardnesses, and that sort of mimics the functionality of like a hard fat, which is not a gel, but it's more of a crystalline material with oil mixed together. And lately, we were very lucky to be able to invent a process in which we take glycerol or glycerin, and we take certain oils like cottonseed, peanut, rice bran, certain specific oils, and we basically take some of the fatty acids that are in these oils and put them on the glycerol, and what we create is partial glycerides, or partially broken down, if you may, like acylglycerols. Like, they're not the full-on thing; they're partial glycerol, and those have higher melting points. So by just running a very simple enzymatic reaction and creating these partial glycerides, mono and diglycerides, the melting point goes up and the whole thing solidifies. So without adding any hydrogenated fat, without adding any saturated fat, you create a solid fat from things like cottonseed oil, rice bran oil, tiger nut oil. There's certain specific oils that do it better than others, and you can think now of locally grown oils being converted in small batches into hard fat. You could think about almost like an artisanal production of these things. Very simple, low temperature processes with enzymes. It's an interesting option to replace many of the uses of palm oil, and then we don't have to extract palm oil, transport across the ocean, get it over here, and we're not necessarily destroying large amounts of tropical rainforests. So we were very happy with that discovery. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really cool, and it gives us the functionality
Yeah.
that is really one of the things that we love about palm oil. John, let's switch gears a little bit. Having started with that foundation, uh, why do we feed palm oil to cattle, and what does it do for cattle?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Well, we feed palm oil for the fat and the energy content of it. Really, that's the issue. And fat, of all the different macronutrients that an animal consumes, fat has the highest amount of energy in it. And dairy cows, well, like any kind of cow, there actually will be in what's called a negative energy balance when they start off their lactation. And different animals have different approaches to producing milk. So some are what are called income breeders, and they will eat enough food to satisfy the needs to make milk. And some animals are called capital breeders. So they basically load up their body with fat and then mobilize that fat from their body to make milk in the mammary glands. So, for example, a blue whale is a capital breeder. A blue whale has a lactation that lasts 6 months, and they don't eat the whole time. They just mobilize everything from their bodies. A cow is like a mix of these capital and income breeders. So they will mobilize some fats at the beginning of their lactation, when they first have a calf, and then later on they will build up their body fat reserves again. Well, there's a problem that they could get in too negative an energy balance, so that they're mobilizing too much fat out of their bodies, and this causes problems for them. So what we do when we're feeding cows is make sure we supply enough energy so that doesn't happen. And fats are a great way to supply lots of energy because, for the same reason they're a problem to us as humans, eating too much fat, too much energy. So for a cow, we don't have that issue. Cows' fat intake is very low compared to ours. Like typically, their diet is about 2% fat, and our human diet is more like 20% fat. So I'm talking just on a dry basis. So cows don't really eat much fat. If you were to give them just any old fat, it's actually going to cause problems in their digestive tract. So they won't eat very much of it. And palmitic acid, this one that's high in palm oil, this 16 carbon saturated fat, does not have those effects in the rumen, in the digestive tract of the cow. So they're able to actually consume that without messing up digestion, and it supplies energy to support the milk production of the cow, especially in these times of negative energy balance for the cow. There's, people have been feeding fat to cows for as long as I've been, aware of what is being fed to cows. And we've gone through a transition of which fat sources worked well, and people have tried corn oil and soybean oil. And because of the unsaturated fat content of those, they really are harmful to the bacteria in the digestive tract of the cow. And so you can't get a cow to eat much of that, and it will mess up the fiber digestion, which is part of what a cow can really do well, is digest fiber. So over the years, people have sourced out different ingredients to use to supply fat and energy to cows. And today we are finding that palmitic acid is, as Alejandro said, is something that's got an economic price tag to it that makes it worthwhile. That's the fat to feed to cows. You don't mess up the rumen. You get the benefit that the cow won't have this extreme negative energy balance, and she'll be healthy. So that's really what we're after here, is a good energy source that doesn't mess with the cow.
Okay, and are cows being fed then these fat supplements throughout their lactation, or when they're in negative energy, only when they're in negative energy balance, which is early in lactation?
So this will depend on how the farm has decided to do their ration formulation. So that's also something that goes through sort of phases of popularity of what to do. So 20 years ago, it was very common to split up a herd of cows into multiple groups and have a different ration for each of those groups. And it was to try and make sure that they don't lose too much weight in early lactation or gain too much weight in late lactation. We've gotten with equipment that's around nowadays. It's very common to feed a single ration to all of the cows, but you might supplement some individually, based on things that you're noticing in those individual animals. And actually, that's an area that we're progressing towards more and more, is individualized attention for the diets of individual dairy cows. Is like, okay, what does this particular cow need based on what we observe and see in her production level, her intake, her energy balance. So there's a mix of sort of different approaches people take to try and deal with this variability you have between cows within a herd. And so fat supplementation is part of your option.
Okay, so it can vary from farm to farm and cow to cow.
Yeah.
It's my understanding, and you can tell me I'm completely wrong, John, that there is also some feeding when there's additional challenge for the cow, like in the summer when we have some heat stress, we might feed it to make sure she continues to be good. I understand that there's also some incentive to feed when there's a higher demand for fat, those incentive days in the Canadian system where you can get a short-term temporary boost in fat.
Yeah.
Is that the case, or am I wrong there?
No, that is the case. So milk, milk contains fat, protein, and lactose. These are the main solid components of milk, and fat is the most variable. So it will change. The percent of the milk that is fat can vary quite a bit, and a lot of it has to do with diet or environment, like the time of year that you're talking about. And say heat stress in cows can also influence it. And during hot times, this might be a better time to actually feed a fat because there's less heat produced by the cow from the fat that they consume compared to, say, consuming carbohydrate and the amount of heat the cow will produce. So sort of the efficiency of turning the diet component into a milk component is better with fat, and there will be less heat production. So this is a reason you'd switch in summer months to adding in fat. When you change the total amount of fat that a cow consumes, then that will change the fat percent in the milk. That's another issue. Or cows in early lactation will mobilize more fat from their bodies into milk than cows in late lactation. And actually, the protein quality that you feed a cow will influence the milk fat percent as well. And the carbohydrate supply will influence it. So there's very many dietary factors will actually influence the milk fat percent, and we're quite familiar with most of those. So there's only a few sort of holes in our gaps in our knowledge to be able to predict, if I change this diet of the cow, what's going to happen to the milk fat percent? And you have to consider more than just the amount of fat the cow's eating, or whether it's palmitic acid or various other fatty acids. But you also got to consider what the carbohydrates are. Are we talking about starch? Are we talking about cellulose? You got to consider the amino acid profile of the protein supplement that they're also getting to make sure they've got enough protein for them. So different amino acids will have effects on the milk fat percent. So diet, it's not just the fat amount in the diet, it's all of the components of the diet integrated together will, ultimately determine how much fat is in the milk that the cow produces.
That's great. One last question, and this is a question I got from a neighbor. That's how much palmitic acid or palm oil, or I think people have this vision that we're dumping buckets of palm oil in front of these cows. My perception is it's actually quite a small volume, isn't it?
It is. So, a cow typically has about 2% fat in their diet, and you can supplement up to about 5%. But typically, when people are doing palm fat feeding, it's probably around 1%. And that's 1% of the dry, of the dry matter, I guess, of the diet. But it's a small percentage of the diet is that. And it may be like 500 grams a day in a cow that eats 25,000 grams a day of dry matter. So,
yeah, that's so it's a relatively small proportion. So we understand then what it does and why we're doing it. A question to the group then: what does feeding, in addition to raising butterfat or reducing the energy deficit that cow is in, what changes do we see to milk products is my first question, and what changes might that bring to processed products? And I have to admit, it's maybe a flaw in my education, but I am going to cop to the fact that I'm an economist, not a biologist. But I actually, it had never occurred to me that palmitic acid is a naturally occurring fatty acid in many animal products. Meat, milk has a natural amount of palmitic acid in it. Breast milk has palmitic acid in it. So, and that's not from people eating palm oil. That is naturally synthesized in our digestive tract, right? Is it? So, having said that, and admitted that I'm, I didn't know, or should have known, but I didn't know. How does this feeding affect the milk fatty acids and then therefore the processed products?
Well, maybe since I've been quiet so far, Mike, maybe I'll jump in
Yeah,
here and just
please.
make a few comments to that because it's a great question and I mean it's a long chain of events, right? I mean, John described the combination of feedstuffs that can be put together, put in front of a cow. The cow then does a phenomenal job of metabolizing that and processing that, and some of it passes into the milk. Some of it is synthesized and used to synthesize other fatty acids in the milk and other components. And then we have that milk coming out of a cow, and we've got multiple cows and multiple herds, all with some degree of normal biologic variation and even some seasonal variation. And then that moves on through our to our processors, who again process the milk depending on the product to be produced, and we end up with different processing plants across the province, across the country, around the world that get milk from sort of farms in their region that might be a little bit different. The feed sources might be a little bit different. So the milk that's arriving there might be a little bit different in composition. And they use that to produce products that probably have a bit of, undoubtedly have some variability in those products that they produce. But that's all part of the biology there. I think one of the things that's really exciting is that.
Well, Dave, I'll jump in and say, we see variability all over the place. I mean, I can buy two steaks on the exact same day and have them taste and texture be completely different. So some of that is just natural biological variability.
Right. You're absolutely right, Mike. But one of the fun things, the exciting things, is that um, I think we're able to dig down a little bit deeper along this whole process as we learn more and more in terms of the diet, in terms of the product, and even in between in terms of the milk. Right. I've been around the dairy industry for close to 30 years. And when I started, we were lucky that we were able to sort of measure the amount of total fat and total protein in milk that was being produced. Now we've got infrared equipment that allows us to, for every batch of milk, every pickup of milk on a dairy farm, we can actually use that equipment to dissect and look at, what is the fatty acid profile of the milk coming from that farm. It's pretty exciting stuff, which allows us then, or will allow us to sort of understand that flow through to the end product, which I'm not sure we do. I'm not sure we're there yet, but we're certainly got the technology where we're moving in that direction.
Yeah, I would like to make a comment though, but I mean, yes, the natural variability, it's an issue, that things don't come from a single source, a single cow. There's always a mixture of things. But I mean, I found, I do not know whether it's a good journal, the Journal of Applied Animal Research, and it's Chamberlain and De Peters paper from 2017.
That's good.
It seems that they only had four fistulated cows, which is not a very big thing, but it seemed to be fairly well controlled, and they added different amounts of palmitic and stearic, right? And the highest level was 2% of palmitic acid,
Yeah.
right? And then on the other side, they have 2% of stearic acid. And under those control conditions, with these cows, which I'm assuming are fairly homogeneous and controlled, and I mean, it's as close to like doing an in vitro experiment as you can do
Yeah.
with live animals. They did get some very large changes in the palmitic acid content. So what I'm saying is that it is possible to increase the palmitic acid content quite a bit. They listed here a very thorough analysis on fatty acid composition, and there's also papers from 2014, I think, that show that the physical properties change. So under extremely controlled conditions, 2 grams of pure palmitic acid, not palm oil, and you can actually go up to almost 40% palmitic acid. Now, if you go back to the Handbook of Lipid Composition, Jensen's one, so there's some data from a good Canadian researcher, Bob Ackman, out of Nova Scotia, and some data on Maryland butter of 1993. So it's a way back, and they come with an average, right? Because of this variability, to give a number is almost ridiculous, right? Remember when we used to have summer butter and winter butter, and butter from this cow and that cow? High variability. So I was trying to look for a data set with a bit of an average, and they report something like a 28% content of palmitic acid. So it is possible to go from 28% to 40%, depending on how controlled your experiment is, right? And how controlled your animals are. Now, from a technological point of view, if you have a fat with 28% saturated fat or 40% saturated fat, you'll have a very different fat. Like the fat will definitely have a higher melting point. The fats rely on their hardness because they're like polycrystalline material. So the fat crystallizes, form all these little fat crystals, and they trap oil within. And of course, it's highly dependent on temperature, right? Take a piece of butter out of the fridge, you can throw it through the window, right? Or if it's a hot day, it's super soft, right? So you got to consider that as well. It's highly temperature dependent, but you can change the content of saturated fatty acids quite remarkably in the same way as you can go the other way, right? If the cow for some reason ends up eating a lot of unsaturated fatty acids, which may not be the best for it, but let's in the balance there, it will have a lot more oleic and linoleic acid. It will go the other way, and the butter will be runny. And I think that's the basis of what used to be the summer and winter butters. Um,
Exactly.
so what I'm saying that it is possible to increase the palmitic acid content of the butter, and if you do that in a controlled fashion, I'm not saying that people do this, you can end up with quite a bit of a harder product. But other things that we're changing are things like the globule size. The fat is not just dispersed, they exist in these globules. So that changes too. They seem to be getting bigger. So now there's other factors that play into it. Is the combination of a little more saturated, or is it really because now these globules are bigger that gives you a hardness? So it may be an indirect effect of palmitic acid that has nothing to do with the palmitic acid content. So it can get complicated pretty fast, but just in this theoretical way, saying if that's the only thing that changed, you can get a harder butter. So there is the possibility that butter is getting harder because it has more saturated fatty acids. Unless I'm
Okay.
reading things wrong.
And yeah, and I think that's valid. I read some studies too, Alejandro. I didn't see that one. I'll ask you to send it to me. Most of the studies I saw in unfistulated cows showed it went from, like you said, 28% to 30% or 31%.
Yeah.
So again, that might be enough to make a difference, but uh, in order for that to happen, and maybe this will be the last question, although I will give everyone an opportunity to say anything that they didn't get an opportunity to say. In order for that to happen, there would have to have been a significant change in the feeding of palm oil over the last 6 to 12 months, and I'll ask John and Dave, who are out with dairy producers on a regular basis. Is there a sense that we've seen a significant change in the use of palm oil in the last 6 to 12 months that would lead to the types of changes that Alejandro was just referring to?
I would speak to say no, not that I'm aware of. So it has gradually become more and more popular over the past 5 years, and I think it's just because of the availability of it and the success that maybe your neighbor down the road is having with feeding this fat supplement, and so then other people have taken it up. But I wouldn't say that there's been a recent acceleration in the use of palm fats.
Yeah.
And I guess from my perspective, I would agree with John, Mike. We've got a couple of studies ongoing where we're visiting farms and collecting data for a number of projects. One looking at free fatty acids in milk, and we're collecting information about what those farms are feeding and their rations. And it gets pretty complex, but one of the questions we are asking about added fats and what products they're using, and certainly um, based on that work, certainly I can't say that we've seen any remarkable difference.
Yeah, it's
I
it's
don't know.
interesting to me. I
Oh, sorry. I
Go
just
ahead,
wanted to
John.
jump in and say that Alejandro, that Chamberlain and De Peters paper is good. I did my PhD with Ed De Peters in fat feeding and stuff. So
Good.
no, it's good.
No, but I
Good.
wanted to take, for example, but John, would it be possible that if you just change, if you feed palm oil, it would be a different dynamic
Yeah.
if you feed the free fatty acids? First of all, gram per gram, you're adding twice the amount, and it is really dose dependent. Like 1% causes the
Yes.
changes you were talking about, Mike. Now 2% is a lot bigger. So could it be just a change from palm oil versus palmitic acid would be a gigantic change in the final composition. John and
Yeah.
David, have people begun using more the free palmitic acid supplement or not?
That is what people are aiming for. And so the supplements that are being used now are something like 85% palmitic acid.
Yeah,
So it's not straight up palm oil, but it's palmitic that has been extracted or isolated from
yeah,
palm oil or from wherever. But that's the preferred supplement now is actually not the straight up palm oil, but it's just a palmitic enriched fat supplement.
that's right.
Okay, so I think that's a great introduction. I learned a lot there. And as we wrap up, I'm going to go around and I'll start with Dave, go in the opposite order of how we started, and say, given the discussion you've heard so far, Mike learned a lot. I'm sure other people will learn a lot. Is there any last point you'd like to make relative to this discussion that will help people understand it better? Dave, you're first.
Thanks, Mike. I guess the point that I'd like to make is that I think we're all learning a lot in this whole conversation, and I think that's fantastic. One of the tools that I sort of alluded to is we're getting the technology readily available and in hand now to look at milk composition and to tie that back to what cows are being fed. Exciting project going on currently in Quebec where they're looking at the fatty acid profiles in milk on dairy farms, on all dairy farms in Quebec, relating that back to the nutritionists and the nutrition that's going into those cows to better understand really how that translates, not just in the experimental setting like we talked about, but also in practice. And so um, I think we're getting tools available, we're getting data available that allow us to, I think, much more quickly understand what the impact is of some of these changes. And as we see changes in whether that's in product or in milk or even in feeds, I think we'll be able to fine tune those a little better, understand them a little better, and have a better sense of so what some of the impacts are there. So pretty exciting. Again, science at the cutting edge and applied in the in the production of all dairy products.
Perfect. Thanks, Dave. John?
I'd like to. I'm not sure why this is such an interesting topic to everyone, and I think partly it could be, out of not not a lack of familiarity with what cows get fed or how they get fed, which is totally understandable. Why would you know that? And so, what I'd like to say is, the ration formulation is very precise. We use computers to do it. So what we do, we don't just look at ingredients, we break them down to their individual nutrients, and actually way more than you would like on a food label for a can of soup or something like that. It'll tell you how many calories and how much protein. Well, we don't we break the calories down into what are the individual nutrients supplying those calories, and even the proteins. We look at different ones, whether it's rumen degradable or not, and we use equations in a computer to actually evaluate the diet and see what it's missing for particular nutrients. And so we use ingredients to supply the nutrients and make a very precise formulation for what that cow is going to be doing and what she needs to have in her diet. And so we pull ingredients based on economic considerations, availabilities. Are they available for us? And so I think people, should be aware of that. How precise it is. It's much better than human nutrition, really, in terms of quantifying what's happening and what's needed.
I was going to say it's cows get better nutrition than I do because they pay more attention.
Absolutely.
We pay more attention to what they eat. You shouldn't pay too much attention to what I'm eating, frankly.
Yeah, exactly.
Alejandro?
Yeah, they definitely don't eat pizza and brownies and beer like you do, and that has a lot of palm
Yeah,
oil.
yeah.
Maybe we are loaded with palmitic acid too. I'm sure I am, for sure. uh, yeah, and all I would say is that first of all, people shouldn't jump to conclusions and judge ethically something that is very complex. I mean, we eat palm oil morning, day, and night, and we're concerned about a few milligrams being fed to a cow. I think that we should be concerned about sustainability, but maybe we should eat less Twinkies, and that would make much of a bigger difference if you're concerned about sustainability, I think. Secondly, and there shouldn't be this sensationalism, right? First and second, there's no data. People have made up. I never knew that we were surrounded by theoretical physicists everywhere, because nobody has shown a fatty acid analysis or a mechanical test. Nobody. So there's a lot of accusations and finger pointing with zero data. So I think we should be a little bit more scientific about this rather than to just blowing it up in the social media. And then last but not least, the marketing bodies and they should be a little bit more transparent. There's absolutely nothing wrong with adding some fatty acids to the diet of a cow. You're not feeding them like sheep brains or something like that. It is a natural component. It could come from palm oil, it could come from cottonseed oil or soybean oil. It is, like John said, highly scientific to keep these cows healthy. The last thing a farmer wants is to damage their animal. They take care of them probably even better than take care of themselves. So I mean, that idea should get out of people's heads. So more scientific, and also this aspect of being transparent about the communication with the public, and maybe at the end, if you actually do an analysis like we're doing over the weekend right now in a very small sample, it was hardly scientific, but at least it will be a first step to having some data to see if these relationships that people talk about are true. Maybe there's no relationship, and maybe there's no palmitic acid accumulation, and maybe there are differences in hardness, maybe they're not. So I think based on the data, we can make some informed decisions that don't need to be blown up out of proportion. That's all I'm
Yeah, that's excellent. That's
Mike,
an excellent place to. Sorry, go ahead, Dave.
sorry, just to make one point, and I agree 100% with Alejandro. The one place where there is some data is in the milk composition data that I alluded to from the studies going on in Quebec, and Danielle Lefebvre from Lactanet, who is leading some of that work, is when this issue first broke, they went back and looked at their data from Quebec dairy farms, and his statement, and it was made publicly, was that they haven't seen remarkable differences in the fatty acid composition of milk going back a year and a half, which is where their data extends to, and that includes any significant levels or differences in palmitic acid and some of the other larger, more common fatty acids. So at least there is some data there, I think, to at least support the argument that we're not sure anything has changed. But certainly, I think we'll continue to dig into this and look for those answers and look to science actually to verify if there is an issue, and hopefully, if there is, then to deal with it.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time. I'm going to wrap up with 3 points, maybe echoing a little bit what Alejandro said. Is uh, people do not, and this is my research, people do not have a good understanding of how we produce food. They don't understand how we feed cattle. In fact, if we ask Canadians, does a cow have to have a calf before she gives milk, basic mammalian biology, many people can't answer that question. So I think discussions like this are important to helping people understand and not jump to conclusions. The second point is relative to uh, not jumping to conclusions, like Alejandro said. Let's get the data, like Dave talked about, like the small study you're doing over the weekend, Alejandro. Let's really understand what's going. I think it's funny. I don't doubt the people who perceive their butter as harder, but in my small sample of one, there's no difference in the butter that's coming into our house, and there's clearly something else going on here. And the last point is, I think, a lesson to me on the power of social media, how things can feed on themselves and get away, and how we should all take a moment to reflect and read and talk to people who know what they're talking about, and get some information before we jump to conclusions. So thank you so much for taking the time. This was valuable for me, and I'm sure it'll be valuable for others who listen.
Thank you very much, Mike, for putting this together.
Yeah, thank you, Mike.
Thank you.